Today, we're diving into a fascinating case from the 19th century, Cumming versus Ince. It's a legal drama with all the right ingredients. A huge inheritance, a vulnerable old woman, and a signature that was literally signed in fear. So let's start with a big question. What actually makes a signature worthless? I mean, we're taught our whole lives that your signature is your bond, right? It's the final stamp of approval. But what if I told you there are times when your signature is worth less than the paper it's written on? That's what we're going to unpack. To get there, we first have to talk about that fine, often blurry line between persuasion and outright pressure. When does trying to convince someone to do something cross over into forcing them to do it? In the eyes of the law, that line is everything. See, at the core of any contract, and I mean any, from a billion-dollar merger down to you clicking I agree online, is one simple but absolutely critical idea: true consent. It means that everybody involved is there willingly, with their eyes open, and without a metaphorical gun to their head. It is the absolute bedrock of fairness. Now, when that consent isn't real, we step into this legal concept called undue influence. This isn't about an obvious threat. It's way more subtle. It's about someone using their power or a relationship of trust to basically overpower someone else's free will. It's like their will gets replaced by someone else's. And you can see the difference pretty clearly here. A fair agreement? That's all about trust, mutual benefit, and free will. It's a win-win. Undue influence, on the other hand, is completely one-sided. It's about exploiting a weakness for personal gain. It's not a negotiation. It's a takeover of someone's will. And this exact battle between free will and coercion is what brings us to our main event. So let's travel back in time to the 19th century to a bitter family dispute over a massive inheritance. So let's meet the cast of characters. First, there's Anne Ince, an elderly woman who is very, very wealthy. Then we have Cumming, one of her relatives, and the thing at the center of this whole mess? A valuable property deed, the grand prize. Now, the timeline here is pretty disturbing. It all starts when Anne Ince is put into a private asylum. While she's in there, totally isolated and at her most vulnerable, she faces constant pressure to sign away her property. And eventually, she cracks. She signs the deed. But that signature wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a huge legal fight. And this is the central conflict. On the one hand, you have a signed document. It looks official, but the context is just awful. Anne Ince was completely alone, in a fragile state, and, this is key, she had absolutely no access to a lawyer or any kind of impartial advice. So the court was faced with one massive question. Was that signature really an act of her own free will? And everything hinged on that one question. The court had to deliver a verdict on the very nature of free will. So how in the world did they untangle this mess of paperwork and pressure? Well, the judges knew this wasn't as simple as just checking if the signature was real. They had to look past the ink on the paper. They needed to investigate the environment, the circumstances, the whole story behind that signature. And this quote from the judge, Lord Cottenham, is just brilliant. It gets right to the heart of it. He said, "The question is not whether she knew what she was doing, but how the intention was produced." In other words, it doesn't matter if she understood she was signing a deed. What matters is why she intended to sign it. Was that intention her own, or was it manufactured by fear? Well, the court's finding was loud and clear. They decided that Anne Ince's consent was absolutely not freely given. The whole situation, the asylum, the pressure, the isolation, amounted to coercion. It was an inherently intimidating environment, and so the property transfer was ruled completely invalid. So what's the legal value of a signature that you get without true consent? A big fat zero. Nothing. Zilch. It was a massive statement from the court that the spirit of an agreement matters just as much as the letter of it. And this case wasn't just a win for one woman. It cast this long, protective shadow over the law that, believe it or not, still helps protect all of us today. Yeah, the ruling in Cumming v. Ince really helped cement this vital legal safeguard we now call informed consent. By focusing on how that intention was produced, the court drove home the point that for consent to be real, it has to be two things. It has to be informed, and it has to be freely given. And that precedent is still used in a pretty straightforward way. First, courts identify if one person in a deal was vulnerable. Second, they look for proof that unfair pressure was used. And if both of those things are true, they can just void the contract to protect the person who is being taken advantage of. And you see the echoes of this everywhere today. This principle is used to stop financial abuse of the elderly. It's why courts can throw out contracts signed under some crazy high-pressure sales pitch. It's even used to look at prenups to make sure they were signed fairly. And maybe most importantly, it upholds a patient's right to make their own medical decisions. So that leaves us with one last thing to think about. In our modern world, with all its fine print and fast deals, where do we draw that line between persuasion and pressure? The story of Ince's is almost 200 years old, but that question feels more relevant today than ever.